At a time when the only modes of transportation were horses and trains, and the first cars were primarily thought of as racing machines for the wealthy, a 16-year-old boy left his father's farm in 1879 with the intention of moving to Detroit. This boy would go on to establish a car company that would completely change the direction of the automobile industry into what it is today. 35 years after arriving in Detroit, the kid Henry Ford went on to become one of the richest men in American history, and have his name attached to half of all automobiles worldwide. On July 30th, 1863, in what is now Dearborn, Michigan, Henry Ford was born on his father's farm. His father, William Ford, owned a farm where the entire family lived and worked. As the eldest of 6 children, Henry was expected to take over the family's business, but he was nothing like his father and had no interest in it at all. At the time, farming was labor-intensive, slow, and rigorous, and although he tried his best to help out, he detested the very idea of it. The person he loved most about the farm was his mother. Henry, like most children his age, loved to learn on his own terms. He never finished the 8th grade and was very interested in mechanics from a young age. His curiosity about machinery led him to study every piece of machinery he came across. When Henry was 12, his father gave him a pocket watch, and after fiddling with its movements, he quickly learned how to take it apart and put it back together, as well as the watches of his friends and family. Later, he developed a reputation as a watch repairman and started repairing watches for people in the neighborhood. During a school trip to one of Detroit's companies when Henry was 13 years old, he saw a steam engine for the first time in his life. From then on, his love for mechanics became an obsession, and he built his first steam engine by the time he was 15 years old. However, Henry's life took a turn when he lost his mother, Mary Ford, to an unexpected illness. Having a close bond with his mother and feeling more connected to her than anyone else on the farm, Henry's hatred for the farm deepened. After turning 16, Henry packed up his belongings and left the village against the desires of his father, seeking a new path in life because the farm had too many memories of his late mother. It was in this city, Detroit, that Henry would throw himself into reinventing himself, learning everything he could about machines. He took a job at a streetcar manufacturing company called Michigan Car Company Works, but sadly, he was fired after just 6 days. At the time, Detroit was rapidly becoming a city of industry thanks to the steam engine. After being unemployed for a while, Henry found work as an apprentice at James Flower & Brothers machine shop, earning $2.60 per week. However, it wasn't enough to cover his rent. He used his childhood obsession to find a night job as a jeweler, cleaning and repairing watches for $3 per week. Despite working multiple jobs to make ends meet, Henry was able to succeed. When Henry Ford turned 19 years old in 1882, he made the decision to go back home to Michigan. Because he still detested farming, he didn't work much there and instead spent most of his time playing and experimenting with the machines he found on the farm. Fortunately, his father had bought a portable steam engine, which had quickly become common among farmers. Henry spent most of his time with this machine and became so skilled with it that a neighbor at his father's farm paid him $3 to run his steam engine for him. From that point on, Ford's love of machinery spread throughout Michigan. Henry's ability was discovered by the Westinghouse engine firm's district agent in Schenectady, New York, and as a result, the firm recruited him. In 1885, Henry's job was to travel throughout southern Michigan to set up and service Westinghouse steam tractor engines. That same year, he met Clara Jane Bryan at a New Year's Eve party, and the two became engaged. As a wedding present, Henry's father gave his son 40 acres of land, but Henry had other plans for the land than to turn it into a farm. Henry and Clara moved to a small apartment in Detroit in 1891. It was during this period that Henry discovered the gas engine in a British magazine. The gas engine was being produced in small quantities by a German engineer named Nicholas Otto and was significantly more efficient than steam engines for a number of reasons, including the fact that it didn't require 30 minutes to start up because it performed all of the combustion internally. Despite the fact that this new engine was rapidly gaining popularity in Europe, very few people in America were aware of it. Fortunately, he was able to locate an owner in the city, and Henry fell in love with the gas engine right away. However, he was unable to comprehend how it operated, and the fact that it was powered by an electric spark made matters worse. Realizing he needed to learn more, Henry applied to work as a night engineer for the Edison Illuminating Company, earning $40 a month. Henry and Clara welcomed their only child, Edsel Bryant Ford, in 1893. 3 months after the baby's birth, Henry received a promotion to chief engineer, paying $100 a week. In the same year, Henry successfully built his first gas engine, paving the way for his dream of building a horseless carriage. He didn't finish his experimental automobile with the gas engine until precisely 1:30 a.m. on June 4, 1896. He named it the quadricycle. Henry modified the quadricycle, which was essentially a crude device made up of 2 bicycles parked side by side and driven by a gasoline engine. Although the experiment was successful, it had some problems of its own. The car had 2 gears, neither of which was for moving forward or backward, and the main issue was that it lacked a cooling system, which meant that after a while, the car would overheat. Henry added a cooling system, which was the most significant modification. He eventually sold the car for $200 and utilized the proceeds for another significant project. Henry started work on his second experimental car with the help of the mayor of Detroit, finishing it by July 1899. This new car was bigger, stronger, and heavier than the first one. One morning, Henry took a wealthy lumber merchant named William Murphy for a test drive in his new car. When the test drive was over, William expressed his desire to support Henry's business endeavor, and they shook hands. On August 5, 1899, the Detroit Automobile Company was established. Henry's first car, which he named the delivery wagon, took 6 months to build and only 20 were produced in the company's first 2 years of operation. Despite all of this, Henry lost his job, but he never gave up hope because he believed that failure is just an opportunity to start over. This time, more cleverly, Henry was glad to be fired since it meant he would have less pressure and could now devote his attention to other goals. Henry had a straightforward motivation for deciding to focus on auto racing. In addition, Henry knew many well-known individuals in the city, but few of them were prepared to invest in his ideas. Racing automobiles had become a highly popular sport in the United States, and Henry needed a platform to show off his vehicles and their excellence. After the events involving the Detroit Automobile Company a year later, Henry's 26 horsepower vehicle became the talk of the town and gave investors the confidence they needed to back him a second time. Ford's newly designed racing car beat the vehicle of Cleveland automaker Alexander Winston as well as the country's top national racing driver Grosse Pointe. The end result was the founding of the Ford Motor Company, with Henry serving as its chief engineer. However, soon after, Henry's job was once again in jeopardy because he was still working on building race cars, which infuriated his investors. They wanted him to build passenger cars that the general public could buy, so they hired another Henry Martin Leyland, to do their bidding. Ford was displeased that they had hired someone else to take over for him, so he quit the company. Henry is cited in his memoirs as stating, "I resigned determined never to put myself under orders again." However, once Henry Ford left, the company's name was changed from Ford Motor Company to the Cadillac Motor Company. Henry Leyland, on the other hand, carried out the demands of his investors and went on to construct what is now known as the Cadillac. One day, while visiting a slaughterhouse in Chicago, Henry saw an assembly line in action, and that's when he had an enlightenment. If he could apply the same concept to the construction of his cars, he could produce more cars in a day. At the time, Ford and many other automakers assembled one car at a time, resulting in a slow pace of production. Therefore, in 1904, Henry raised additional funds, built his own factory, hired over 300 workers, and started experimenting with the assembly line inside his new facility. The Model N production didn't really use the assembly line until 1906, but even then, it was still a work in progress. Nevertheless, it increased production levels by 5 times, and Henry's new model went on to become the best-selling car in the United States. But Henry had bigger goals in mind. When the Model T was first released, it was one of the most expensive cars that Henry Ford had ever made. The price was set at $850, which would be roughly $21,000 in today's currency. Despite its high cost, the Model T quickly became a fan favorite in the US. Henry Ford had always dreamed of creating automobiles for the average person and for everyday use. Within days of its debut, 15,000 orders were received, and Ford Motor Company quickly rose to the top of the American auto industry. What more could he ask for? Henry realized he needed a larger factory to produce more than 100 Model Ts per day. So in 1910, he constructed a new facility in Highland Park, Michigan. After a number of experiments, the assembly line was officially put into operation by 1913, allowing workers to carry out their jobs rather than moving vehicles in and out of them. The new process also allowed for a gradual reduction in production time, from 12 hours to 90 minutes. By 1914, when their production rate of over 300,000 vehicles was greater than all the cars made by other automakers combined. Approximately half of all the cars on the planet were Fords by 1916, when the number of Model Ts produced increased from 20,000 to nearly 1 million. Henry came up with another brilliant strategy to differentiate himself in the automobile market. As the number of Model Ts produced rose annually, he lowered the car's price. Even though Henry Ford invented the assembly line, many of his workers weren't happy with this innovation. Many found doing the same thing over and over again boring, and the skilled craftsmen among them found their new job insulting as they were tasked with just 2 duties instead of building a whole car. As a result, workers started to leave Ford to work for other companies. In fact, by 1916, the price of the Model T, which had once sold for $850, was now selling for less than $400. However, that wasn't the only brilliant strategy Henry employed. Henry responded to this by doubling the workers' pay, which he raised to $5 per day. Many businesses mocked this action, thinking it would cause the firm to fail fast, but it had the opposite effect. Mechanics from all over the nation rushed to Detroit in quest of greater salaries. Henry Ford bought out all of the other investors in the company in 1919 after growing weary of their interference. This decision not only created several millionaires in Detroit but also made Henry Ford the sole owner of the largest automobile company in the world. Later, Henry appointed his 26-year-old son, Edsel Ford, as president of the company, but it was Henry who really ran the show. However, having complete control over the company came at a cost that even the wealthiest man in America could not ignore. As the stubborn and stiff-necked man that he was, Henry refused to listen to other Ford executives or even his own son, Edsel, when they said it was time for a new model. By the late 1920s, he could no longer ignore the declining sales figures and finally decided to shut down the Model T assembly line and start designing an entirely new car. Henry continued to believe the Model T was the car most people wanted. The new Model A was introduced in 1927, but instead of being made at Highland Park, Henry wanted to build a larger factory along the Rogue River in Michigan. He wanted to include every step of the manufacturing process, from raw material refinement to the automobile's final assembly, and he succeeded in making this factory the largest in the world for steel, glass tires, and other parts used to build cars. However, Henry Ford's one-man show of decision-making was no longer a recipe for success, and by 1936 Ford Motor Company had dropped to third place in the US market behind General Motors and Chrysler Corporation. Even with Henry Ford's most recent inventive design, the V8 engine, things were only going to get worse, and as the Great Depression deepened, Ford was forced to reduce his workforce and his rates. Following his son's stomach cancer death in 1943, Henry continued to head the Ford Motor Company for 2 more years until transferring leadership to his grandson, Henry II. After retiring to his estate, Henry passed away on April 7, 1947, from a brain hemorrhage. As one of the largest automakers in the world, Ford Motor Company is valued at around $70 billion today. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe and like the video if you enjoyed it. Until the next one.